My guest on today's episode is Michelle Dowd. I first became familiar with her story through a Joe Rogan Experience podcast interview, and I quickly went out and found her book, Forager. I read it, I related to it, I connected to it in such a deep way. I have a long history of being involved in the church, and the cult that Michelle was raised in mirrors in many ways the church that I was raised in. And so that's where this episode begins, is a conversation about religion. But if you are in a tense, difficult, or even oppositional relationship with religion, I encourage you to listen through, because even if you don't believe in a God or a higher power at all, and science is your jam, you are still making choices about how you interact with the world based on that thing you believe is the key to the universe and its inner workings. And that's what makes this conversation magical, is that we talk about how our deepest rooted beliefs inform our behaviors. Real quick here, Michelle Dowd is a journalism professor and contributor to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Time Magazine, Alpinist, and other national publications. She's raised on a mountain in the Angeles National Forest, where she learned to identify flora and fauna, navigate by the stars, forage for edible plants, and care for the earth. Her memoir, Forager, Field Notes on Surviving a Family Cult, showcases her life growing up on an isolated mountain in California as part of an apocalyptic cult, and how she found her way out of poverty and illness by drawing on the gifts of the wilderness. I have links to her website where I just read her about bio. You can grab the book for yourself. I highly encourage you do that. If you have any background in religion, I think you're going to find so much to connect to. And then the flora and fauna aspect is what made this a really magical read for me. You will enjoy a ton. I'm going to have links to her Substack. She does Forager Fridays through Substack. This is where I host my podcast as well. I follow her and recommend her newsletter. You can find and read her newsletter every Friday, and it is a wonderful contribution where she reflects on what's going on right now in her world and connecting it to the wilderness and the wild. I think it's a beautiful, remarkable thing. I'll have links to her books as well. And I'm going to go ahead and link to the Joe Rogan Experience episode where she's interviewed, because I think that 3-some-hour expansive conversation is something that will nourish you as well, no matter what your background is. Real quickly, this week I'm only going to do one episode, so I want to run through just as fast as can be some of the statistics that I've had in working on my social media. So this week, I did not go out of town over the weekend. It was a home weekend for me, and that's nice because I'm going to be out of town all of the next weekends, basically up to Thanksgiving. One thing I want to mention quickly, I did reach out to a couple of gun shows. Now, I got the idea while I was in Madison at their Tattoo Fest. One of the vendors there said that she has amazing success at horse shows and that she had wanted to go to gun shows, but she felt kind of opposed to guns and ammo and all that kind of stuff. And so she'd never done it, but she knew that they were a great place for a lot of vendors. And her point was basically, maybe the men won't be the biggest buyers of my novels at those shows. Maybe they will be really dialed in on the guns, but men come with their wives, men come with their children, and people need things to do to busy them. And so they hang out around the vendor booths. And I thought, man, that sounds like a great idea. So have not heard back from the organizers of those gun shows yet, but I did apply to get some booths coming up here shortly. And that is an exciting kind of in-person event that might expand where I can go to sell books to more readers and find people from an expanded kind of cultural footprint. So I'll let you know how that goes. Again, I wasn't anywhere last weekend, so no organic growth in person on my Instagram, but I did continue to post multiple times, really focusing on the visual memes on Instagram. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I believe I am at 684 followers on Instagram. So we did have some continual steady growth, not as large as the past 2 weeks. Also, I didn't have any reels pop quite as well as they had the past couple of weeks. I think my largest reel did around 4,000 views, generated some followers, wasn't huge. And as of this exact moment, I have no digital book sales for the week. I was really hoping that I was going to be able to report that I had some, but I'm going to continue to do this. I will say, yesterday, I was pretty discouraged because I knew that it wasn't the kind of week I'd had in previous weeks. And I was thinking about, is this a bump in the road? Do I need to make some adjustments? And I'm considering those things. Sometimes the raw truth is you just have to push through even when it doesn't feel good. And that's kind of how the last week was for me, is push through, continue to do the things that were working in the last 2 weeks, and expect that maybe this week I'll have multiple book sales, and the ebb and flow of things is just part of the process. Now, if I go multiple weeks without seeing any kind of digital correlation between what I'm doing and book sales, then I might start to look at how I can adjust what I need to do. There are areas where I can definitely improve. So I will have a full episode on that next week. I don't have any interviews lined up at the moment, and that is the series I continue to promote right now, is how organic growth on social media is affecting book sales. And that's probably the biggest constellation in my sky at the moment. Now, without further ado, please enjoy my interview with Michelle Dowd. I was reviewing Forager this morning, and something kept sticking out to me. I have a background as a Southern Baptist, which, when I read the book, there's so much that spiritually feels just the same as what I grew up in. If you take away all of the isolation and the things like that, the Bible verses and everything that you cite are Bible verses that were near and dear to me growing up, things that I based my life and my understanding around. And so it just made me wonder, from a spiritual perspective, how are some of those things still lingering with you in the way that you have like your worldview?
Great question, Jody. It's interesting. We spent a lot of time as a community down south, and my grandfather came from Oklahoma. I think that that's not exactly the South, but he had a lot of, I guess, history of John Wesley and a lot
Hmm.
of, I don't know, probably a spiritual tradition. He didn't talk about this, but those are the hymns that, so he acted
Yeah.
as if the spiritual tradition came out of nowhere. So I was not raised to
Interesting.
think about our belief system in terms of denomination.
Sure.
But since then, I have actually come to believe that Southern Baptist was a great influence in
Hmm.
probably his parents, the way that they taught him religion, even
Yeah.
though he didn't ever say that out loud.
Yeah.
So first of all, I think that the Bible is an amazing work of history. I think
Yeah.
that there are beautiful works, chapters and verses of poetry, and there's a lot of truth. I don't feel that the scripture itself was particularly harmful to me growing up,
Yeah.
and it doesn't trigger me when I hear verses now. I understand faith traditions. I no
Mhm.
longer subscribe to that as a faith tradition.
Yeah.
But it's certainly the poetry of the Bible certainly got inside of me, and I still think of verses all the time.
Yeah.
Like, they
Yeah.
songs too, like hymns, come to me, and I don't, I guess, see that as something negative in my life. I see it as part of a culture, and I think that in this country, a lot of us come out of a very rich religious culture that then can, I think, be transformed into something that's a little bit more spiritual and a little
Mm.
bit less dogmatic.
Yes. Yeah, I've had a similar journey. I shared with you in the email that I sent, kind of getting ready for this. My wife and I lost the daughter. She was born prematurely and was never alive outside of the womb. But she was at the point where she could have been born and survived, and so it was a stillbirth, and it affected us in ways I think that I still don't fully understand. I've written 2 novels that deal with the loss of a child. If you ask me on a day-to-day basis, it's not necessarily the front of my mind, but I think, like, I saw religion in a completely different way. And so there are people now who accuse me of being a heretic because I left the church based on that experience, or that was the catalyst for the experience. And it's hard for people who are still part of religion to look at you and say, like, oh, you just quit because of a tragedy, because you don't think God is good. all these different things that they've said. And I wish that they could be a bug in my brain to understand how I think about faith, because I think I still have a fairly strong faith. It's just not subscribing to the name of a god any longer or the name of a denomination. From what you said, it feels a little bit to me like maybe you're in a place where there's a level of spirituality that just doesn't have those doctrines.
Yes, and I'm so sorry for your loss, yours and your wife's, Jody. That's tragic, certainly.
Yeah.
I would also have guessed that it wasn't really the cause of why you left the faith, but yes, a catalyst. And I
Yeah.
think many of us have them. I will add that I just met a group of people who can they started their group called that they're survivors of religious trauma. They now call their group, I should say our group maybe because I might be a member. I'm not sure. I mean, you don't
Yeah.
have to be a member. You can just go if you want.
Yeah.
But they call it spiritual resilience. That's the name of
Mm.
that's what they renamed it before I got there. So and I just met them. And spiritual resilience seems like a beautiful way to reframe that. They didn't want to define themselves by trauma because but each one of them had been raised in some form of high control religion and have
Yeah.
found pain and suffering that caused that they then felt that they maybe made negative choices in their life based on, that they
Mm.
ran from something that was hurting them and then hurt themselves to some degree, and
Yeah.
now have come to understand spirituality as necessary to their own understanding of the world, their own meaning seeking.
Mm.
And I think it's a beautiful way to think about we all, I think, have a spiritual craving, and religion has dominated the way that we express that in our particular country. But throughout most of human history, there has been pantheism. There has been a
Yeah.
understanding of nature as a manifestation of God, and God is not outside of us, but God is within all of us. And I think that is not really that antithetical to much of what I was taught. Not really. I
Yeah.
mean, that we've been considered heretical for sure,
Yeah.
and I do think there's a lot of people in the tradition that still want to think of a top-down God, a hierarchical
Hmm.
God that has rules for us. But even if you have a really open mind, Jody, I feel like who is interpreting what God says? I mean, it's always a
Hmm.
person. It's almost always a man, but it's a
Yeah.
person who says this is what God wants, and that's not really God. That's an interpretation of God.
Right.
So I I just think when it comes to religious institutions, it is really difficult for me to believe that any one person running a church or a collective, like a board who runs a church, really has any more access to God than the rest of us.
There's a verse that you cite in the book that was kind of central to everything you were taught, which is, and I can't quote it correctly, but I think out of the Proverbs, the idea that like there's a way that seems right to us, but in the end it leads to destruction. That's a verse
I can
I
quote that one, King James Version. There is a way that seemeth right unto
yeah.
a man, but the end thereof is death.
Yes, and that verse played so many tricks on my mind because what it essentially does is it tells you that you can't actually make a logical leap to a god. Therefore, everything you think is just stupid and you have to take someone else's advice. But inside of that, I think you lose so much of what a relationship with a higher power or the source might be. And I wish I could say I don't still wrestle with those things, but the truth is, I see plenty of evidence in my life of making really bad decisions based on the best information I had. It's pretty tricky.
Yeah. I mean, there are times we make decisions based on what felt right in the moment, and then we find out that maybe wasn't the best decision. But I would offer that, I can't speak for your particular choices,
Yeah,
but I look back on my life and I think, but who's to say that going through what looked like the wrong decision didn't lead me to somewhere I needed to go? And
yeah,
it would be, I think, a little, I don't know if the word is crazy, but a little misinformed to think that you could live a life without making mistakes, or that you would
sure.
always make decisions that you would look back on and in retrospect say, wow, every single time I made good decisions because I did
Yeah,
what felt right to me. We look back and we say, yeah, that was what I knew at the time. It led me somewhere that caused me pain, and I'm no longer in that place.
yeah,
So who's to say that you didn't go through that And then there's so much too that's so out of our control, like
Hmm.
the loss of your child. Like that's not a bad decision you made, and it's something that happened, and maybe, some people would attribute that to God, but whatever you attribute it to, it's not something that you could control.
Yeah.
And there are so many things in life that feel like we made choices that led us there. It's possible that that was outside of our control too, and that we could
Hmm.
have made other choices and ended up in the same place. I mean, we don't know that.
Yes, very true. And this, again, is stemming from religious tradition that I'm still embroiled in, whether I want to be or not. But there was a situation where I unquestionably made bad decisions. I was in a management position. I was sent to Alaska to work with a guy that was not doing very well out there. He didn't show up. I was trying to kill time. My boss was like, "Look, just go have fun in the town till you get in touch with him. Keep trying to get in touch with him." I sat down and had some drinks at a microbrewery, and I had fun, and then a few months later is when we find out about our daughter. And I told my wife, like, I think rationally I understand that I wasn't to blame. Feels very much like the King David thing that you talk about. Like, hey, you are being punished for being an idiot, or for going against my will. And I know I'm starting this really heavy, but I do have a plan to kind of turn and move the conversation away from quite such weighty manners. But I think that this is important. This lingering sense of religious tradition pushing on the way that we view the world.
If there is any sort of God, I don't believe that that is a God who punishes us by taking away our
Yeah,
children. I just
right.
don't think that that sort of punishment makes sense. I also don't tell anyone, including myself, that I have any idea, if there is a
Yeah,
God, what the purpose of that is, of what
right.
anyone's loss is. Like I don't propose to know that.
Yeah,
And I think that there are so many tragedies in people's lives who I mean, there's also a Bible verse that it rains on the just and the unjust, and that's straight
yes.
biblical too. We
Yeah.
we don't know what causes some of the tragedy. And there's kind of an old Buddhist tradition too that there's I mean, it's a long story about like a barn, and the barn's on fire, and the neighbors are like, "Oh no, this horrible thing happened." And the man says, "We'll see." And then the horses that ran away came back, and they're like, "Look at this wonderful thing happened." He said, "We'll see." And then his son breaks his leg, and they say, "How tragic." And he says, "We'll
Yeah.
see." And then his son doesn't have to go to war, and so then it looks like a blessing. And how we don't really
Mm,
know in the scope of any one life what is a blessing sometimes, and what is it. I mean, we know things that feel like tragedies to us, but we don't really know in the greater vision of life, what
yeah.
is coming. And yeah.
It's undeniable that our daughter, again, was the catalyst for leaving the church. She was the catalyst for us moving back to rural Nebraska. We were living in Spokane at the time, and I don't think that we had planned to go back. There are so many things in our life that happened because of that one experience. And like you said, there are huge blessings. What a weighty word, but there are huge blessings that have come to us because of all that happened. And there are some deep pains that we've experienced as well. So how I want to try to pivot now is taking that and knowing, I think from a religious perspective, you took it harder on the chin than I did. Like I grew up pretty normal as a Southern Baptist. You grew up really excluded, but from the framework of being raised in that environment, now you are on a journey to get your memoir in front of and I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'm just going to say it how I believe it to be, and you can correct me where I'm wrong. But you're on a journey to get your memoir in front of as many readers as you can, especially those people who might experience healing from your journey, and also to validate's not the right word, but something close to that, the experience that you had. And so there's this weirdness of like, okay, I need to figure out how to get a reader. And there are all kinds of assumptions. Do I just have faith in the greater good to get it out there? How much do I participate? Do I get punished if I make wrong steps? I'm trying to build a constellation, and I just want you to talk about that a little bit because I have to believe that your faith and how you get your book and your work out into the world are intimately connected.
Hmm. No one's ever asked me that. I think that's a beautiful question. I'll say that it wasn't my intention. I didn't start this process to do that.
Yeah.
But I think my journey, like everyone's journey, is a little unusual. I'll say that something that has surprised me since the book came out is how many, especially women, but some men too, who come from really disparate backgrounds, sometimes in other countries, who maybe their parents were missionaries, or
Mm.
I've heard from people in various African countries who really felt that they had really strong patriarchal religion, and they found their
Mm.
way out of it. And they felt very, very alone, and they felt that what they had been taught was something they didn't want to deny every aspect of it. And that is the part that keeps coming back with readers who relate, is saying, I don't want to turn my back on every single thing because then I'm left with nothing. But I could not live in the tradition that I was being raised in, and I lost my people. And many of us
Yeah.
lost whole communities. We lost love, we lost connection, belonging. And I do think that that is something I suffered, I feel like, more than I needed to, because I didn't know how to find the next connection. And so if the book
Mm.
can bring the awareness to people that there is connection out there, even if you can never go back, and many people can't go back to the community of origin, and they can't reconnect with family even. Sometimes,
Yeah.
I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who grew up gay, and their families, well, they didn't know they were gay, but they grew up, they discovered
Yeah.
that about themselves, and their families don't take them back. They think that that was choice and that they chose poorly. And I could see that that is just causes so much pain. And so connecting to other people who were ostracized from their faith traditions for whatever reason,
Yeah.
that we have so much in common, and we are a community. We just don't all live in the same geographic space, but we can connect to one another. And so when you talk about like getting in front of readers, or giving people opportunity, it's interesting. I have been very responsive, I think, has been my approach. So even from the beginning, I never
Yeah.
sought an agent. All of those things came to me one step at a time. Every time I was asked to do something, there was a degree of courage that was required of me to say yes
Mm.
to it. But my journey has been a lot more saying yes to opportunities rather than
Very cool.
seeking them. And I've had to say no a little, but not a lot,
Mhm.
because ultimately I have said, if it was a mistake to try this, I mean, there are certainly people who judge me for going on Joe Rogan. I think people, I won't get into all their reasons, but
Interesting.
and
Yeah.
not close friends, but people who have just really felt like he doesn't represent what they think is good in America or whatever.
Mm. Okay.
And I my belief is, even if that were
Mhm.
true, do we really want to not have conversations with people who don't fully agree with
Yeah.
us? I mean, what is the point of a conversation if you're not
Right.
listening? And then also, I try to only take conversations with people who are willing to have a conversation with me, who are not just lecturing
Yeah.
me, but they're interested in the exchange. And I think that is the way I've approached it from the very beginning. When I had some of your listeners might be interested in this, because I took a publishing meeting. So my agent sent out my proposal, and she
Yep.
sent it to a few people. We sold it within a week of her initially sending it out. She said we might take some calls, and publishers often do want to talk to you before they agree to extend a contract to you. And I had a conversation with the editor who ended up being the acquisitions editor for Algonquin. And in our initial meeting, she said she didn't like the plants. She thought that that was really
Hmm.
kind of just kitschy. It didn't really work with the story. And she's like,
Really?
what's the purpose of this? Yeah. And I
Okay.
said, oh, it's absolutely necessary. It grounds us in a sense of place. It works as metaphor, but it's also literal.
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't think so. Anyway, we had this conversation, and
Yeah.
I texted my agent and I said, that went really poorly. She doesn't like me. Sorry, but I
Yeah.
couldn't agree. I just couldn't do what she wanted. Right. So I just thought,
Mhm.
well, I'm done with that. And the next day we got a contract. And what she said to my agent was that she said, I was so impressed that she had an understanding of her vision and that she wouldn't waver
Hmm.
on it. That that's what I look
Wow.
for in an author, a person who knows what it is, the story they want to tell. Because I hadn't written the book yet. Right. And I
Yeah.
felt very
Oh,
committed.
wow. Yeah.
So I basically said, if we can't have the plants, then we don't have a book. Like I won't write
Yeah.
this book without the plants. They are the vehicle through which
Wow.
I am telling this story. And I think that
Hmm.
that's relevant because I think we have to trust ourselves. And I do. I think that, and we need to talk to people who will at least listen. She didn't cut me off. She listened. But
Yeah.
I honestly thought she almost hated me. I was like, this woman does not like me. She doesn't like my vision. But she was pushing back, maybe not as a test. Maybe she really believed what she was saying, but she was
Hmm.
convinced because she was listening. And I think that's all we can ask out of conversations is that somebody comes to the table willing to listen. And then we,
Yeah.
of course, must come to the table willing to listen.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. I actually expected this was going to go a different direction from the way that you framed it. I thought you were going to end up with a different deal with a different publisher. So that's really cool. And then I'm thinking of her and I'm like, oh, testing an author. That I would have never been in a position where I think, is this a test? Which I'm not saying that that for sure is what she was doing, but that's really fascinating. The plants are absolutely necessary. The lichens at the end is a really strong connection to everything. But like the pine cones that have to go through like 400 degrees of heat before the seed comes out. If that's not an amazing metaphor, I really can't think of many metaphors that would lift more weight than that. It was great. Since we're talking about that, I want to take just a short stop to ask you about writing in the present tense. I have my theories about why you chose the present tense for the memoir, but I'd love to hear from you when you were putting it together, why you went that way.
So it was obviously an intentional choice. It was
Yeah.
first person present because what I wanted to do, and I think some critics have said about the book that it's choppy at the beginning, and it's because I was writing in
Hmm.
the voice of a child, and it was very intentional. That is not the voice I have now. I wanted to show what it is like inside of a high control group, inside
Yeah.
of what we might call a cult, and not what I think about it now. And so I wanted to show the naivete, and I didn't know how to
Mm.
do that other than it would have been very removed to say, back then I thought,
Right.
then I didn't know. I mean, I break that fourth wall a few times to say that I didn't yet know this, but
Hmm.
I wanted to take readers on the journey of not understanding something to the place of feeling, and I think whatever the catalyst is, in my case it was more than once. I wanted to show that
Hmm.
cycle of feeling like you're getting drawn back in again and you almost get out and then you get drawn back in again. And I didn't know any, I couldn't think of a better way to do that than to be on the journey from the perspective of the person living it. And I was not an adult, and so I did not
Yeah.
have an adult sensibility, and I didn't understand abuse. I tried very hard in the book not to name things that I would not have been able to name.
Yeah.
So the book would be extremely different. In fact, I think my upbringing was harsher than I gave weight
Yeah.
to in the book because I didn't want to judge something that at the time I could not have judged.
Yeah. That's actually one of the standout pieces of the book in general is that I personally was lulled for long passages into thinking like this just sounds like an idyllic childhood in some ways when you're not having a crucible moment where somebody is not threatening sexual abuse or the physical abuse and those kind of things. Like you go through chunks of time where you're just tromping around in the wilderness having a grand time, and I liked that you got that sense. It gave real weight to the moments where there was badness because you saw nuance, and it would have been really difficult in my opinion to create that nuance if you had written from the removed past tense, sort of looking back on things. The other piece that, and maybe you didn't do it for this reason, but one of the things that felt so right about the book is how from the present tense, especially in the first person, you're forced to put your own brain in that situation. And so, in a unique way, it was as if I were experiencing it. And that would not happen in past tense either. And so, I thought that that felt like a fairly intentional and a key move for the book.
Yeah, I like that you recognize that. I also intentionally left a lot of white space, meaning a lot of things that were unspoken so that a reader could bring to the experience the similarities between their own childhood, because we all have certain similarities of coming of age type stories. And
Yeah.
I wanted it not to be so detailed that a person couldn't bring themselves to the story. I think as a writer, it's very important to understand that no one really cares about your particular journey. What they want is to go
Yeah.
on a journey. And I think that the more that we can help people identify the parts of themselves that can relate to another human being, the more that we give a gift to our audience. And I think that's an
Yeah.
important part of storytelling.
Yeah. So a couple of things wrapped in here is you talked earlier about people being critical of you being on Joe's podcast, which wouldn't have dawned on me that, I mean, thinking about it now, obviously he drives a lot of conversation both directions, but um, the idea of being part of a cult is drowning out anybody else with different opinions. And cults do it really specifically on purpose. They keep everybody out so that you are just washed in their theory and their philosophy. I see that kind of happening right now where people want you to distance yourself from yucky stuff. And in doing that, it's almost as if we're propelling our own little cults forward. I guess you've
Absolutely.
probably experienced that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a huge risk and danger with so much bifurcation. It's like a false dichotomy. You have to be like, if you're not this one thing, then you must be the other. Like that, we have
Yeah.
to take sides, and obviously in the political arena, but all over the place. What some people call cancel culture, the idea that if you make a mistake, you don't belong to us,
Yeah.
whoever us is, and people segmenting off into groups. And with young people, even teaching young people that once you have in education or whatever, now you're part of the educated people, like,
Yeah.
and you're speaking a different language than people who are uneducated. But people's intelligence is so diverse, and we can learn so much from people who were not traditionally educated.
Yeah.
And I think about this also. I have a newer friend who came out of this book. I mean, I met because of the book,
Yeah.
who was raised by his mother was a former nun, and she was ordained as a nun, so you know, um, she had like celibacy as part of her contract, and she
Yeah.
met a priest who was, and anyway, they ended up both leaving their
Yeah.
orders and having him. But she never talked about religion, and he felt that she had so much sorrow and anger and all the things
Mm.
built up, and so he really related to a mom that was very complicated, and he related to a mom who was brilliant but also just dangerous and like mean a lot, but she
Yeah.
just like segmented completely. And I
Mm.
thought that was really sad, and also I understand that, and that's one of the things I tried to get across in the book, that I have decided to do is to always leave the window open. When people say you close the door, you never go back. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to go back and live in the community, but I
Yeah.
don't know, like I think that I, I try not to burn bridges with anyone, because
Yeah.
I don't know if, who's going to, I don't know, come in or out of my life who needs to have a conversation. And so I try really hard to,
Mm.
even when I'm skeptical or a little uncomfortable about something, not to make my decision based on whether or not I agree with anyone. Like
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, if I think that there's potential for abuse, then I try to steer clear. But other than that, I'll pretty much walk into anything,
Yeah.
because I feel like as long as I'm able to freely make my decisions, and that's something too. By the way, Joe sent a driver, and that driver said, "Hey, if anything happens that makes you uncomfortable and you decide to leave, I am here. Like, my job is to wait for you. You can
Yeah.
walk out at any time." And he said, occasionally happens where someone doesn't want to continue the conversation. He said, "So my
Wow.
job is to make you feel safe." And I
Wow.
felt really safe. I felt very like supported. And
Mm.
obviously the conversation didn't go, I mean, things go maybe not the way I expected at any given moment, but
Sure.
I never felt unsafe in having the conversations. And I'm
Yeah.
grateful for that.
Yeah. Very interesting. I have, and I've talked about it on my podcast before. I have quite a bit of admiration for him. I've never viewed him quite the same way that some people around me do, feeling like he's very politically aligned or anything like that. He he just has always seemed really curious, and I've appreciated that about him. It's hard to find people in the world who seem to keep an open mind. Um, but that's actually really stellar to almost basically say like, hey, I'm sending somebody to you in case you need to get out of here. That's a cool move. Soaking that
Yeah,
in a
and
little
he's
bit.
also, was really clear that I wasn't supposed to disclose where I was going, so and all that, the address, and I
Yeah.
think they do try to keep it very protected, so they don't want you to feel like just because it's a protected space that you
Yeah.
can't get out of it. It's like there's
Yeah.
and I respect too that there's, if you are that well known, you're
Yeah.
gonna have haters, and
Oh
he needs
man.
to keep his whole staff and everyone safe, and yeah, so I mean, I
Yeah.
followed all the rules. He asked me to, didn't bring a phone in, didn't do all the
Yeah.
things that, you know, to disclose any information about where we
Yeah.
were. So
So,
yeah.
while we're talking about Joe, I do want to ask you because I think that this is a lot of people listening are they're going to believe that to be a guest on his show is going to make your career and you're never going to have money problems again because so many people know about you and everything is just like that's the moment. I know this not to be true, but I also am interested from your perspective. What opportunities came up because of being able to interview on his show? I'm assuming it's a net gain, but I'd just love to hear from you, like doors that open and things like that. Not, I'm not asking this question. I fear that you could hear me asking so that I can like revel in what it would be like, but I'm more asking for people who really get an opportunity to get in front of a large audience. What are the rewards, I guess?
So I'll start by saying that Michael Shermer was on the show several times. I talked to some other people who'd been on the show several times, and as well as a friend of mine who had been on the show many years ago before Joe was as big, and it's probably one of
Mhm.
the reasons I got on the show. But and maybe they had to cancel it. I mean, I don't really know actually how I got on the show. They don't tell you that because
Yeah,
what they don't want people to do is to try to follow whatever formula they use.
right.
I mean, they have
And
one.
I'm not asking that to
Right.
be
So I don't know
100%
the answer
clear.
to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But what I heard from a lot of authors before and after is that it's interesting you don't get such a spike in sales that people think you
Yeah.
would, partly because a lot of the audience is not, they're not necessarily readers, and also
Yeah.
because Joe doesn't sell. Like you're not holding up your book, you can
Yeah.
talk about it, but he's not pushing people to buy the book. He doesn't say
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And so I don't know what the spike of sales were. I am now getting
Sure.
royalties, and I I don't know, like I didn't have access to an author portal at the time, and you also
Sure.
don't know long term what caused, the chain reaction. What I have gotten since is a lot of letters, and there has been some harsh things, but
Yeah.
mostly people who probably would never ever have picked up my book in a million years,
Yeah.
saying, "Wow, I had this experience," and many of them aren't going to read the book, but they're
Mm.
having conversations with the void maybe, but if someone writes me a thoughtful letter, I wrote them back.
Yeah.
If they said something that I felt that they were being genuine and they had a need to talk about something, I did write back. I think I wrote back every single person who
Wow.
wrote me with a more than just a sentence saying like, "Oh, I like," I don't know. Some people wrote
Sure.
stuff that was maybe not on the topic that I
Yeah.
didn't write
Yeah.
them back. But I think that one of the things that I got out of the experience is that how many people are struggling
Mm.
with high control groups and how much damage religion has done. And that use the word validating. I mean, on some level, it's validating. I felt very seen and very,
Yeah.
um, I mean, again, I had people write me and tell me why I'm destroying the universe through, negating religion, or I had some men want to mansplain to me like what the nature of the Bible is and why I misinterpreted it. And I'm like, I
Yeah.
was not saying I'm interpreting the Bible correctly. I'm saying what it meant to me at the time.
Right. Of course.
So I got positive and negative feedback, but I think the positive probably result has been more opportunities, more speaking engagements, more
Yeah.
opportunity to be part of a public conversation. And I
Yeah.
think that you can't even measure how
No.
beneficial that could be long term. Like with my next book, it's possible that the audio sales went up significantly.
Mhm.
Um, my audio sales were already good, but it's possible that that continued that. So I think
Yeah.
that maybe people were more likely who are listeners to a show like that, more likely to want to hear the book than necessarily read it.
Yes.
So, um, but I'm giving a talk next week that I'm very proud of, and I think that being invited to be guests places in person and online has been something I didn't anticipate. When the book
Yeah.
first came out, I never expected to be any sort of public speaker. Like I don't
Okay.
consider myself, I've never taken a speaking class in my life. I don't have,
Mm.
any formal training or I never had a desire to be a public speaker. And I have had opportunities that I'm sure I would not have gotten otherwise.
Yeah. That's something that I think there's a really big part of me. I mean, my whole podcast really is focusing on how to get your book out there in the world and get more readers. I've waffled back and forth between using the word sales because I don't like feeling transactional about this, but I want books in people's hands and I want to make a living off of my book. And I'm able to do that, but it's largely because I'm going to different conventions around the country. I'm
Mhm.
popping a tent at a convention and talking with people, building a relationship, and then selling books that way. And that's 90% of my book sales. And so there is a deep interest, I think, for me and for a lot of the people who listen to the show of what are the kinds of things that you can do to not feel all salesy and gross, but yet be able to get your book out there. And I don't know that this is necessarily a question. I would like to know how much you think about that because I could see you answering both ways. I have a friend of mine, Brad Listy, who has a great podcast, and he he wants to sell his book, but he refuses to sell his book. Like he refuses. He feels morally opposed to the idea. So let what sales come that may. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
That is fascinating. So when you use a word like sales, I see what you mean about, it makes it
Yeah,
sound like it's a marketing ploy.
yeah.
So something I am particularly proud of, I'll address is that in the state of Utah, so I'm a finalist, and I don't know when this decision is made, but for the most, I don't think it's the most checked out library book, but it's the
Oh wow,
most valued library book in the state of Utah and for
wow.
their public library system. And I was thinking Utah, of course, must be full of many religious people.
That's what I was
And
thinking that. Yeah,
and possibly people who wouldn't be able to buy the book because they might be teenagers or other things. And I thought, so that's not sales for me, but it's readers for me.
yes,
And
yeah.
it's something I just never would have thought about. So a public librarian wrote me about it, and she showed me how it was on this list, and it was from their public library system, and then like just astronomical numbers of people who had checked it out. And I felt like, I mean, that's where that book needs to be then, right? In Utah,
Yeah.
which is not a place I've given any talks. It's not a place I've
Oh,
ever
wow.
showed up at a convention. It
Yeah,
is just, there seems to be a need for that type of story in Utah.
definitely.
So I think we never know. I think that just like musicians, I mean, if you're not willing to go on the road as a musician and sing your songs
Yeah,
live, you're not going to get as many plays on Spotify or as many purchases. I mean, it's
yeah,
that's kind of nature is people need us to actually have a relationship with you, and going in
yeah.
public is how people do that. And I love reading. So when I hear about a book, I might hear about it on a podcast or whatever. I do buy books. I support
Mhm.
authors. I do pre-order because I understand the importance of that.
Yeah.
Especially, so to me, I will privilege contemporary writers. I've
Mm.
studied past writers. I mean, I, went to grad school, did all that, but
Yeah,
now my purchasing 100% on contemporary authors. I will only purchase books. I might check
yeah,
something out of a library, but all my purchasing goes to real life people who I know have worked so hard and are still working in the world to tell their stories. And I guess I don't have a marketing plan. So in that
yeah,
sense, I'm on that side of it. I never set out to have a marketing plan, but because I'm with a major publisher, they had a publicity plan for me. And they told me like
yeah.
to place essays, for example, right at the beginning. And so I was in Time Magazine a couple times right near the beginning of
Very cool.
like when my book first released. And I think placing essays is not something I had thought about being relevant. And so I
Mm.
wrote some original content and then allowed for some content from the book to be published. And I thought Orion Magazine did some, like I did some work with them. And I think that what what I've come to understand is if you're not willing to have a conversation with the public is probably not going to
Yeah,
be interested in having a conversation with you. And your book is just part of the conversation. Like it is,
yeah,
and it's a valuable part because you work so hard on it. But people want to understand what the issues are and how they relate to them before they spend money purchasing something.
yeah,
And book sales, are being more diversified between more authors. Some people say they're down. It's possible book sales aren't down as much as
yeah,
individual books are down because there's so many more books on the market.
yeah.
Um,
I know that
so
there has been a trend where new authors are actually privileged a little bit more than established authors in a lot of cases because the publisher is looking for that next big author who's going to really rock it. So they'll give you one chance, and if that book doesn't do well, you might be blacklisted. So you see a lot of first-time authors not get a second book deal and have to pivot and that kind of thing. So there's pros and
Absolutely. That
cons.
is something I didn't know, and that is a little bit scary. I have a
It
proposal,
is.
but I have been very reluctant, for a couple reasons. Well, I work with a shed, and they are now, I can say this publicly, they have gone, through a restructuring, and they let
Ah,
go a lot of people, but Little Brown bought Algonquin, and
oh,
it's so there's this big transition, and most of the team I worked with has been let go. And
wow.
so I had to give Algonquin my proposal, but I pulled it because I thought, you know,
Mhm.
I just need to give it a moment to settle, so I can get a good offer, et cetera. But one of the big things is if you're not a debut author, you got to make sure you've earned out. You got to make sure that,
Mhm.
you have to give your first book time to do well. And if it's not an overnight sensation, and most books aren't,
Yeah,
yes, I don't know if it's blacklisted, but you're not going, they will not give you a second book. They will not pay you for that. So
yeah,
I don't know what percentage of the books earn out if you got a decent advance. I'm very grateful that I've already earned out, and then I am
yeah,
collecting on it now. That does give me a better chance at being part of the next conversation. The book I'm working on now is called Prodigal Daughter, and I feel like it brings up certain things about religion, but it goes off in a much more adult level than
mm,
like a coming of age story. And
yeah,
but yeah, it is a tough market out there, and I do think you have to diversify your own expectations, but also what you consider being an author. It does require now being a public figure. It really
yes,
does. I mean, otherwise you're not
yeah,
going to sell. You have to put
yeah,
yourself in the public eye, and that
yes,
was never something I wanted to do at the
yeah.
beginning. But it's not as scary. I meet wonderful people like you.
Oh, well, thank you. It does bring up, I think, a natural place to talk a little bit about Forager Fridays and your Substack newsletter in general. It's brilliant. It's so good. I like that some of them are very short and to the point. Others are longer. You've done a little bit of guest posting. You do a lot with that platform to put yourself in the public in an environment and an atmosphere that you're comfortable with. Was it a logical thing for you to do, or was it something where you thought, I do need to have more content, more stuff out there for readers to read? Um, yeah, talk a little bit about your Substack.
I wish I had done it earlier, much
Yeah,
earlier. I should have done it before the book.
yeah,
If I had had it going when I was if I'd had it established when I was on Joe Rogan, I probably would have gotten quicker results with that. Um, it was a choice to go on Substack because I realized that never in my life have I collected emails. Like I
yeah,
am not a marketing person, and I wasn't raised in that tradition. So I have had so many opportunities to talk to people, and during even my book tour, I wasn't collecting addresses, like
wow,
emails. That was
yeah,
crazy. Like I should
yeah,
have had, and I say to all of the writers out there, do it earlier.
yeah,
Like, and take, because you're going to want to be able to have conversations with your public. And I didn't have a
hmm,
methodology for doing that. It was just I was waiting for other people to invite me onto their shows, or.
yeah,
And so what Substack does is it gives you a chance to find your readers, especially readers who are really interested in the topics that you're
yeah,
passionate about. And so, again, I wish I'd done it earlier, but I am committed. I've been completely committed to dropping a post every week. I'm starting to share a little bit more about my personal life. I'm starting to feel safer in that space doing
mhm,
that, and I hope to move into the space of doing that even more. It feels like a safe space for writers to share
yeah,
not just intimate details about their life, but to practice material, to do stuff that's maybe a little
yes,
less polished and have more
yes,
genuine conversations. I've really enjoyed the other writers I've met on that platform. And I would love your listeners to join us there. I know,
yeah,
Jody, you're on Substack as well. And
yep,
it's a wonderful way to have conversations with other people who value language and value this form of communication. So I'm
yeah,
very happy to be there. I've got some paid subscribers, I've got whatever, but
mhm,
to me, it's less about the money, although I think there are people who make a good living there.
yeah,
To me, it's more about finding out who my audience is, not even creating one, but just finding out who's there, and then
yeah,
giving people what I think the conversations that they want to have,
yeah.
and the
I've
ones
been
that I
so.
feel qualified,
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
to
Sorry.
have with them. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been surprised with my experience on Substack. So one thing that they do that very few people seem to know is that they actually are a host for podcasts. So I used to pay for a podcast host, and they give it to you for free, and it's you can take it or leave it and bring everybody with you. So it's a zero risk proposition to host your podcast with them, which I love, and that means every episode I drop, everybody gets an email. There's a new episode out. I've seen huge growth in the podcast just through using the platform. I can't think of a negative thing to say about Substack at all. I love everything that they do. The one thing that I still haven't quite cracked the code for is how to get more interaction on the posts. And it'll always be this moment where I'll send something out because I do a stack for my podcast, and I also do a stack for my novel readers. And it's just when I think I must be doing something wrong because nobody cares. Like I see my opens and they're great and all of those statistics, but the comments don't come in. And then I get a personal email from somebody who's like, "Thank you so much for this." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, you're out there. You just don't feel the need to comment and validate me every single week, right?" So that's been an interesting piece of Substack. But like you said, not as much the paid subscribers as the ability to have an audience that likes seeing your email come up.
I love that you brought that up because I think there are people too, and you and I are not two of them, who don't like talking in public. And so
Yeah.
I will get emails, people will respond. So for those listeners who don't know, when you write the Substack post, that the people don't necessarily receive your email, but they can respond and it goes to your email. I get tons of letters that way that are not. Um, I don't even know if those people go on the platform, but they respond to my
Yeah.
email that goes out in my, generated. So I honestly have, I want to say a couple hundred emails that people write me, but they're
Yeah.
not putting anything public. And
Yeah.
so, I know that for the algorithm, it's really good to have public comments, but
Hmm.
not everybody wants to do that. And
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that you're not being read or heard or shared. They may not be sharing you on the platform, but they may be sharing your information or your content with other people in their lives. And I think
Yeah.
we, like everything I think in life, we don't get to decide the outcome. We need to commit to the work that we believe is ours to do in the world and share from the position we're in to share, and then just trust that our audience will find us.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes when we get so hung up and on like trying to build and build and build and build, sometimes we need to show up and be more courageous and like
Mm.
be more vulnerable. And that's what starts building the audience, not knocking on
Yeah.
more doors.
There's something I probably won't even be able to really get at what I'm thinking, but there's something about desperation when you talk about building. Um, Podcast becoming a household name is the title of the show, and it's because I have my mind set on this idea of being mentioned in the same breath as a Stephen King or a J.K. Rowling. Um, and I'm crazy enough to believe that I can achieve that if I keep working hard and taking appropriate risks and all of that kind of stuff. But there is something inherently, I'm struggling for the word here, the desperate, I guess, is the word. There's something inherently desperate. And so I notice that it will influence choices that I make. It's really interesting to have to guard against my own desperation and say, "Hey, you know what the goal is. You understand that. Just calm down and keep doing the work." I don't know if that relates for you or not. I'm curious. Well, does it? Does that relate to you at all? Or yeah,
So I feel like I've lived my life backwards in many, many ways. And I would say I've
yeah,
come to this through the back door rather than the front door. And so I've always, I think, been a person who is responsive, and I do take risks now, but I don't generally make those risks happen.
yeah,
The risk is the saying it, yes. Um, but when you said that phrase, like just do the work, I have always believed that my job is to do the work. And then the result of the work is somebody else's job and it's not really mine.
mm,
And I understand now in publishing that you do kind of have to put on both hats, but I
yeah,
still think that doing the work. So I was a professor for my whole adult life. I started teaching college when I was 21. And I have always taught young people. And I feel that I've said things over and over and over that finally got in my own head. But
Yeah.
I would tell them, you have to master the craft. You cannot be out there. Like, you can do
Mm,
whatever you want, but until you master the craft, nobody, even when you get your opportunity, it's like,
yeah.
we hear the phrase, luck favors the well prepared. You have to be prepared, because
Yeah.
when the luck happens, you have to have something to say, and you have to be able to articulate it in a way that other people are going to see you as a professional. And
Mm,
just because you have some great ideas when you're 19 doesn't mean that you know how to stand behind them,
yeah.
or to be able to hold court with diverse people, etc. So it is something I worked with young people a lot on, and I did not put my own work in the public at all, because I
Mm,
didn't consider myself a content creator. I considered
yeah.
myself a teacher. And so I was spending all my energy teaching other people and not really thinking about ever. Like, I
Mm,
never collected an email. I didn't. I left my job recently because I love what I was doing there, and I wanted to pursue this full time. So that was a
yeah.
risk on my part. And I feel very grateful that I was in a position to be able to take that risk. But had I taken care of my own marketing, I would have had a lot more to take
Yeah.
with me when I left. And I didn't. And so I still come back to, if you do the work, you keep showing up,
Yeah.
um, your audience will find you. But you can't, you do have to show up. You have to show up in the
Yeah.
public, not just show up on paper. You have to do both. But that, yeah, like, we have to get good at what we do. That's the other
Yeah.
thing we do. And it takes practice, and you need to practice in the public eye. Like, as a podcaster, you you're a wonderful conversationalist, but you also, I'm sure, have learned over the time you've been doing it, how to hold conversations, not just with your guest, but have conversations that your audience wants to hear. And because we
Yes.
both of us are talking right now for an audience, even though we're talking to each other and
Right.
we respect each other, but we know that as we're having these conversations, that we want to stay relevant, not just to each other. So we're not just
Yes.
telling our inside jokes or doing whatever. We
Right.
are trying to make this meaningful to other human beings. And I
Yeah.
think that's what we do when we write, and we try to be meaningful to other people.
What a strange, I've never talked about this on this podcast before, but if there's one area that I wish I could improve in, it's exactly what you're talking about. I think that there's two edges to this sword, because the fact that I'm not necessarily thinking about my audience right now, I'm thinking about like what I want to get out of the conversation, helps me to be a little bit better at the art of holding a conversation, because I'm not
Mm.
going to steer you away from where we're naturally going. At the same time, my podcast just bites really hard when it comes to like the consistency of a question or a format or something predictable that people can be drawn into. On social media, I don't have any kind of brand. I've done terribly at that kind of stuff, and I do sometimes think about it. And I'm like, I wish I could figure out what my niche was for all of this. And I'm just floundering when it comes to that kind of stuff. That's my email address thing. Like you're saying, you wish you would have collected emails. I wish I would have thought like, what do people want from me?
Well, and what do people want? They don't even know what they want from you, but, like,
Yeah,
what is it that people, what is the gap in their knowledge or
yeah,
in their experience, and what can you bring that's intuitively yours, something
yeah,
you have a skill set and knowledge base in, but what can you bring to people that they're not already getting somewhere else?
yeah,
And I do think that that takes a little time to find that. And I don't know, like, even when I've done public engagements, something that I'm finding that I did not know, so this is not something that was I didn't decide this, I
yeah.
discovered it, is how many young people particularly, but how many people really feel that they want a place for their spirituality. And something you brought up
Mm,
right at the beginning, but, like, people who don't, it is a huge trend of people leaving organized religion.
mhm.
And there is, for the first time, like, ever, young women are not going to church as much as men. Like, women really
Wow.
are leaving the church. And that is brand new. And I
Mm,
think the Atlantic had an article about it. And I think, oh, there's all these people who want to identify
mhm.
as part of a community, and they want to have a faith, but they cannot have a faith in this patriarchal tradition that has hurt so many. I mean, it's hurt humans,
Yeah,
but it's a lot of women who have been hurt
yeah,
by what the church dictates for what it means to be a godly woman.
yeah.
And so that is not something that I thought, I didn't really anticipate discussing religion at all when I wrote the book. Like, I really just thought it
Yeah,
was about
that's
leaving behind
hilarious.
And then I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, wow, there seems to be a need of like people asking me, where are you finding that
Yeah.
sustenance? And I happen to be a yoga
Information.
teacher as well. And I have found a lot in the body, like what it is, what the wisdom we can find in our
Hmm.
bodies. And that is something that the church I was raised in absolutely did not want anything in your body. Like it was
Yeah.
like you close off your body. You are
Right.
just a spirit and maybe a little bit of a mind, but like your body's not relevant.
Wow.
And now I, of course, connect to people about the body wisdom and what we know inside of
Yeah.
us.
I hope that that's a conversation that we can have because I feel like there's a whole second hour inside of that, and kind of a logical furthering of what we've talked about how to take your work out into the world is starting inside of your body and understanding the wisdom that you're talking about. Because we are coming up on your next appointment, take a moment to let people know where they can connect with you, and the best place to do that.
The best place to connect with me is on Substack. If you're already on Jody's Substack, I hope that we'll recommend each other, Jody.
Yes, of
And
course.
but yes, so find me on Substack. I'm happy to have conversations publicly or privately through Substack. Forager is available on Audible, and I am the narrator on that. And it is also available wherever books are sold, including Amazon if you happen to shop there. And there's Kindle versions and things, but there's hardback, paperback, Audible, and the Substack is the place where I'm having the most meaningful conversations with my audience, with my readers.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jody. I hope we can talk again.
Becoming a household name won't happen overnight, but with your help, it can happen for me or for anyone you know who's on this journey. If you liked what you heard today, would you consider sharing this podcast with someone you know would love it too? Word of mouth is the single biggest difference maker for a dreamer's outcome. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.